So in its essence, the very first corporations were ever created in order to take private money and do public projects. And frankly, folks, I'm here to tell you that is brilliant. That is a brilliant way to actually organize capital in order to do a public good. So if anybody tells you David Cobb or Move to Amend are anti-corporation, you can tell them, no, that's actually not true. We are not anti-corporation. Corporations that are actually operating the way they're supposed to operate, including making a profit, we are for those. I am pro-business. I am also pro-democracy, and when big corporations come in and hijack democracy, then I got a problem. But here's the thing. We recognize that the creation of the first corporations come out of the Roman Republic in order to take private money to do public goods. But that's not how the modern transnational corporation works, is it? No, I'm afraid not. Because now we actually have to talk about the creation of the modern transnational corporation. And it was birthed in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century of Europe. You know, the age of discovery. I have to put discovery in quotation marks, right? Because what did they discover? Africa, Asia, later North and South America. Newsflash, there were people living there. They were not lost. They didn't need to be discovered. In fact, another thing that I'm kind of angry about now that I actually know a little bit about world history, do you know what that age really is? That's the age of rape and pillage and plunder and murder. The reality is that that era was specifically a time where empires were built. Colonialism or imperialism really began at a worldwide scale. And check this out. The corporation was created in order to facilitate that. Literally, some of the first corporations, the Dutch East Indies Corporation, was specifically designed to allow the military to go to what we now call Indonesia, military conquer and kill people, and then steal their resources and do it legally. Likewise, the Africa Trading Company. Anybody want to guess what the Africa Trading Company traded?
Slaves.
Slaves, but what else? People. I mean, slaves, I think, is the correct answer. But you know what? I used to say that all the time, and then somebody said person, and I had like, yes, because slaves abstracts it for us. Let's say it like it really was, people. And because that gives me the opportunity to say, people just like us. Stay with me. Because the reality is, first of all, if you go back in history long enough, guess what? We're all Africans. Right? Anthropologists are very clear. Like we all come out of Africa. So that might actually be another way for us to get in touch with our humanity and our sisters and brothers in the Balkans and in South America and in the Middle East, and recognize that we are really all one people, you know. But even deeper than that, I say people like you and me because the reality is that at the DNA level, at the scientific level, any scientist will tell you that race doesn't exist. I mean, skin pigment exists, for sure. I mean, like different of us in this room have different skin tones and skin colors. But you know what? Hair colors exist too. Different hair, well, for me, no, but for some of you in the room, for many of you in the room, you know, you've got different hair colors. Different eye colors exist, right? But no scientist would ever take skin pigment and elevate it to the point of anything meaningful as a taxonomy, right? So the thing is, and here's the thing, race doesn't exist, but hold on to your hats, racism does. I mean, like, this is the thing. Race doesn't exist, but racism does, because even though race doesn't exist at the scientific level, because we all act like it exists, presto changeo, it now exists. And the reason I'm making a big deal about that is to really point out and force us to confront the reality that we create reality. We collectively create our reality by how we think, and how we think impacts what we say and what we do, and by thinking and acting and saying certain things, we literally create the reality. Which means that we have both the right and ultimately the responsibility for our own reality. And I'm here to say, I don't like this reality, so I'm working hard to change it. Right? The reason also that I think it's important to underscore race is, if it doesn't really exist, then what the heck? Why was it created? And I'll tell you, the Africa Trading Company had a big part in playing that. Why? In order to justify the slavery of Africans. Like, for example, if Nancy and I are in different tribes, and our tribe goes to war back in the day, way before, like, you know, 5th century, 6th century, and we defeat their tribe, I capture Nancy, I put a spear to Nancy's throat, and I say, "You are not my slave, Nancy." What is my legal justification, my philosophical justification for enslaving Nancy right now? It's the spear. It's nothing else, right? There's nothing else. Power. I got you. That's it. Check this out. Race gets created for the first time in human history in order to justify enslaving people on the basis of their pigment and for no other reason. So I'm making the point that racism itself, the creation of racism itself, and the transnational corporation and imperialism are all intimately tied during that time period. And then fast forward to the 16th century, 17th century, and we have the founding and the creation of the United States of America. How many colonies? Colonies, colonialism, imperialism, worth noting. How many original colonies?
13.
13. How many of those colonies were actually corporations? 13. Literally, well, there was a land grant.
Some of them were royal charters, not.
But a royal charter is a corporation. A royal crown charter creates the corporation. We can, if we really think that, if we want to parse it.
Close enough.
Close enough. We can parse some distinctions. The point is that these corporations, for example, Massachusetts was not the Massachusetts Commonwealth in its creation. It was the Massachusetts Bay Trading Company. Right? Virginia was created as the Virginia Company, the Providence and Rhode Island Plantation. Georgia was a penal corporation. Yay, Georgia, my daddy's people. And by the way, do you know the color of the skin of the very first slaves that were put to work in the Georgia Penal Corporation? They were white. They were white. They were white. Why? And how did that happen? Because just before that, a couple hundred years before that, in England, the people were mostly indigenous, which is to say they were rooted in the land where they lived. They lived in forests and savannas. They were horticulturalists. They were hunter-gatherer gardeners. They literally lived in the land. They didn't, look, they were part of the land. The land owned them. They didn't own the land. That was a completely different mindset. But then the king and the aristocrats began the enclosure movement, where they enclosed natural lands artificially with fences and excluded, in the property law, the first right of property, the right to exclude. For the first time, the king claimed the right to exclude human beings from what they are part of and said, you can't come here anymore. And then they were forced to either become wage slaves in the growing mercantilist economic system, or they could be literally captured and sent off to Australia or Georgia. That's how it worked, right? Wow. And it's also worth pointing out, you know, if race is a construct, if corporations are just a construct, Massachusetts is a construct too. In other words, it doesn't really exist in any real meaningful way. I mean, surely the forests exist, the mountains exist, the rivers exist, the fish within those rivers exist, the people living there exist, but that line on a map, that's just an idea. It only exists to the extent that we think that it exists, and of course, because we think that it exists and act like it exists, Massachusetts now exists, right? So this is kind of an interesting thing for us to really ponder, I think, about in what manner and to what extent we're actually going to take responsibility for thinking like this. So I guess the point is that as I think about the founding of this country, we realize that the king, through the royal charter, either was creating either land grants or actually colonies of business interests. But either way, the king created every single one of those through a royal edict. And by the way, the king who was sovereign at the time, where did the king get his power and authority? God. Well, he enforced it through the spear, but the legal justification for God, for the king, was God. And let me tell you something, folks. You do not get more legitimate if you genuinely believe that your power comes from God and everybody else agrees with you. Right? Here, let's do a thought exercise. This experiment. This is fun. At least it is for me. Watch this. Close your eyes with me and say this to yourself. David Cobb is the king. I told you this was fun for me. David Cobb is the king. And as the king, he is God's representative on earth. And therefore, everything David says must be obeyed. David Cobb is the king. And as the king, he is God's representative on earth, and therefore everything David says must be obeyed. David Cobb is the king. Okay, open your eyes. Any of you buy that? Right? I could do this all day, and all you would do is get annoyed at me, or bored, or just walk out. And you know why you didn't buy it? Because it's nuts! I mean, that's just crazy talk, right? The idea that somehow I have the right, the authority to tell you how to live your life as an individual, or even better, how the entire society ought to be operated, that's crazy talk. And guess what? 500, 600 years ago, everybody believed it. And except for those people who didn't believe it, for the most part, they said, I'm going to keep my mouth shut, because I see what happens whenever people disagree with that idea. So the divine right of kings, which today we think is just kind of crazy, was literally the way that most people actually thought, that that's how governments actually operated. And I think that that's kind of an important idea. And speaking of the king, I once said, the American revolutionaries were not calling for more socially responsible king. And so too today, if we're concerned with corporate power, we shouldn't merely call for more socially responsible corporations. But then I realized, actually, in the 1740s and the 1750s, the people who would become revolutionaries were, in fact, calling for a more socially responsible king. And it went like this. Those people were writing letters that went, "Oh, dear Father King, we, your humble children, come before you on bended knee and ask that you intervene on our behalf, because Parliament and your governors that you have appointed are oppressing us mightily with unfair laws. So we come to ask your intervention and guidance. We, your obedient children, Englishmen that we are, humble ourselves before you and ask for your assistance." And that kind of sniveling, groveling, obsequious language in one generation went from that to get out. And I got to tell you something, folks, like straight up and for real, as somebody who claims to be a revolutionary, me, and I'm very serious, a non-violent revolutionary, but I am a revolutionary. As a revolutionary, I look at the American Revolution and I say, what were those people thinking? What did they start to say to each other? What did they do together that got them off of their knees, bootlicking, and had them stand up, put their shoulders back, their chin up, and look at the king? And where did the king get his power and authority? God. And look at the king, and behind the king see the spear of the most powerful empire that the world had ever seen, and said, "You're done." Man, I mean, that's both courage, that's power, that's vision. I want to be like that. And I am not even joking.
Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine. Common Sense, the most popularly read pamphlet that had ever been produced at that time. And by the way, Thomas Paine, with that money, all the money that he made from the sale of it, what did he do? He gave it to the revolutionaries. He literally funded the American Revolution. Thomas Paine deserves a place in our pantheon. And I think actually it was his advocacy for free love and against both religion and slavery and racism that they said, you can have one of those three, but you can't really be for all three and stay in the history books. Too bad, but he deserves it. And thanks for reminding us about Thomas Paine. So the point is that the king had been the sovereign, the authority, the ruling part up to that day, but the king gets kicked out, right? And so finally, a new government gets instituted.